When I first met Lucas, it felt like one of those relationship stories long where everything aligns too perfectly to question. He had this gentle confidence, the kind that makes you feel safe before you even realize you're letting your guard down. But right from the start, there were tiny moments, little pauses, overly thoughtful concerns, compliments that somehow redirected my behavior that didn't sit right with me. Still, I pushed that discomfort aside because I wanted to believe I'd finally found someone steady. Looking back, that desire was exactly what he counted on. He always framed his control as care. If I wore something slightly bold, he'd say, "I just worry people won't respect you," with a soft smile that made me feel guilty for even questioning him. In toxic relationship stories, manipulation rarely begins as aggression. It begins as protection, and that was Lucas's signature. He monitored my schedule to help, offered to manage my appointments because he was organized, and slowly taught me to depend on his guidance more than my own. At the time, it felt supportive. Now I see it was conditioning. The strangest part was how natural it all seemed then. He made me feel chosen, almost treasured, as if he saw parts of me no one else bothered to understand. But every time I expressed my own preferences, there was a subtle redirection. Nothing harsh, just enough to make me question myself. It's wild how easily control can hide inside affection when you want something to work. And in those early weeks, I didn't realize those soft touches of influence were just the first threads of something much darker waiting to unfold. The first time Lucas twisted one of my memories, it was so subtle, I almost apologized for something I knew I hadn't done. I mentioned a conversation we'd had earlier in the week, and he smiled, calm, patient, almost amused, before saying, "You're mixing things up again, babe. That's not how it happened." In that moment, I felt this tiny drop of doubt hit my stomach. It's ridiculous how fast a single sentence can make you question your own mind. In relationship stories long like mine, gaslighting never arrives with a shout. It slips in like a whisper that sounds reasonable. Soon those corrections became a pattern. If I brought up something hurtful he'd said, he'd insist he'd meant the opposite. If I sensed tension in his tone, he'd gently tell me I was projecting, and each time he wrapped the distortion in warmth, making me feel almost ashamed for noticing the shift. Toxic relationship stories always have that moment when the world tilts just enough for you to lose your footing. For me, it was realizing I had begun rewriting my own emotions to match his version of events. That's when the confusion became a constant hum in the back of my mind. What bothered me most wasn't the lies, it was how convincing he made them feel. I'd lie awake at night replaying conversations, trying to figure out whether I was too sensitive or simply forgetful. He once joked that I should keep a diary so I don't mix things up. And I laughed, but deep down, it stung because part of me wondered if he was right. The truth is, emotional manipulation doesn't destroy your reality all at once. It erodes it, grain by grain, until you can't tell what's real anymore. And I was already slipping without realizing it. The more I dug, the more the pieces stopped fitting together. I started noticing how his phone was always face down, how he'd tense up whenever I walked into the room, how he suddenly had late-night deadlines for a job that never used to demand them. My gut twisted every time he slipped out with that rehearsed smile, the one that used to make me feel safe, but now only made me feel stupid. One night, while he was in the shower, a notification popped up on his screen from a name I didn't recognize. Not a message, just a preview list alert. My heart dropped into my stomach. I didn't unlock anything. I didn't snoop. I just stared at that tiny rectangle glowing in the dark, asking myself why he needed to hide so much if everything between us was perfect. That night, I barely slept. My brain kept replaying the small red flags that I had ignored because I wanted to believe in him. The moments he twisted my words, the times he acted like I was overreacting, the way he could make me doubt myself with just a sigh. And now there was clearly something else happening behind my back. It hurt. Not because I was afraid of losing him, but because I was starting to realize he was never really mine in the first place. I kept moving through the days pretending nothing was wrong, but inside, everything felt sharp. Every word he said sounded rehearsed. Every smile felt borrowed from someone else's life. I started paying attention to the moments he thought I wasn't watching, the way he'd check his reflection before stepping outside, the sudden bursts of energy before he left the house, the softness in his voice when he answered certain calls in the other room. And the strangest part? He acted calmer, almost relieved, as if my silence made everything easier for him. He didn't realize I was studying him the same way he used to study me, except my goal wasn't control. It was clarity. One evening, I followed my instinct and opened the wardrobe where he kept a small travel bag. Something told me to look. Inside, I found cologne I'd never smelled on him, a shirt I'd never seen him wear, and a folded receipt for a dinner for two from a restaurant he told me he didn't like. My hands shook so hard the paper crinkled. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being dramatic. He was building a whole life outside of ours, a life he never intended to share with me. And for the first time, instead of crying, I felt something colder. A quiet, steady certainty that the truth was on its way to me, whether he wanted it or not. I stopped pretending everything was normal the moment his behavior shifted from careless to calculated. He started coming home later, always smelling like a perfume I didn't own, and avoiding eye contact as if my gaze could expose him. Every excuse felt copied and pasted, and I could feel the distance growing like a wall he hoped I wouldn't climb. My gut wasn't whispering anymore. It was screaming. So I paid attention. I watched how he locked his phone the second I entered the room, how he'd get dressed with the level of care he never used with me, how he always seemed emotionally drained after work meetings. The more I observed, the clearer it became. He wasn't just hiding something, he was hiding someone. And that realization felt like a punch I couldn't dodge. One night while he showered, I checked the small backpack he kept by the door. Inside, I found a restaurant receipt for a dinner for two, a shirt I'd never seen him wear, and a hotel keycard. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. That was the moment the illusion shattered. Not because he betrayed me, but because I finally accepted the truth. The life I thought we shared was just a cover for the life he was living without me. When I confronted him with the hotel keycard, I didn't raise my voice or cry. I just asked a simple question. Who were you with? He froze, and for a split second, I watched every lie he'd rehearsed collapse behind his eyes. Instead of answering, he tried to flip the moment on me, accusing me of snooping, of invading his privacy, of being paranoid again. But this time, his gaslighting didn't land. I wasn't confused anymore. The next day, I decided I wouldn't waste my energy arguing with someone committed to deception. I needed clarity, not drama. So I went straight to the source he couldn't manipulate. His digital trail, his emails, synced calendars, and a hidden folder on his laptop told the full story. Another woman he'd been seeing for months. Dates carefully planned, hotel stays disguised as business trips. Seeing the evidence hurt, but it also gave me something I hadn't felt in weeks. Certainty. I didn't wait for an apology or explanation. I packed my essentials, left the apartment key on the kitchen counter, and walked out quietly before he got home. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. I realized that staying would have meant accepting a version of love that slowly destroyed me. Leaving wasn't just an escape, it was the first decision in a long time that actually belonged to me. I thought leaving would bring instant relief, but the first night alone hit me like a wave. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment I had ignored, every intuition I had silenced just to keep the peace. It was painful to admit how deeply I had betrayed myself trying to protect a relationship he was never protecting. But even through the hurt, a quiet strength started to surface. I finally felt like I was standing on my own side. A week later, he started calling non-stop. Voicemails filled with excuses, dramatic apologies, and claims that I had misunderstood everything. He tried every angle: guilt, pity, anger, nostalgia, but none of it shook me anymore. Every word only reminded me how easily he twisted the truth when it suited him. His voice no longer had the power to pull me back. It only confirmed that leaving was the smartest decision I had made. I blocked him everywhere, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. And once the noise stopped, I finally heard myself again. The silence was uncomfortable at first, but then it became peaceful, almost sacred. I realized I had spent so much time surviving his chaos that I had forgotten what my own life felt like without it. That's when the heaviness lifted. I wasn't just moving on. I was reclaiming myself. A few days later, I received a message from an unknown number, a screenshot of him out with the same woman he'd been hiding. Instead of hurting me, it finally brought closure. Seeing him continue his routine of lies with someone else proved that none of this was about me being not enough. It was about him never being honest with anyone, including himself. For the first time, I felt detached, almost relieved. That's when I made a decision that surprised even me. I forwarded the screenshot to the woman not to create drama, but because she deserved the truth I had to uncover the hard way. Her response was immediate: shock, then gratitude. She told me he'd fed her the same excuses, the same stories, the same rehearsed charm. Hearing her pain mirrored mine made everything crystal clear. He wasn't a partner, he was a pattern. After that, I stopped looking back entirely. I blocked the new number, deleted every picture, and cleared every message. Not out of bitterness, but to create space for something real later on. Something honest, something reciprocal. And as I sat in my quiet apartment, I finally understood the real turning point wasn't leaving him. It was choosing myself with no hesitation, no fear, and no apology. A few weeks later, I started rebuilding the small rituals he had slowly erased from my life. Morning coffee without rushing, long walks without checking my phone every 5 minutes, laughing with friends without feeling watched. Each simple moment felt like a piece of myself returning. I didn't realize how much of my identity had been shaped around managing his moods until I finally lived without them. One afternoon, while sorting through old files, I found a letter I'd written to myself months earlier, back when I first felt something was wrong but didn't have the courage to act. Reading it now felt like hearing my past self begging to be saved. It broke my heart, but it also made me proud. I wasn't that woman anymore. I had become someone who trusted her own voice more than anyone else's validation. That realization changed everything. I stopped wondering if I had made the right decision. I stopped imagining different outcomes or rewriting the past in my head. Instead, I focused on what I had gained: clarity, strength, and the ability to walk away from anything that demanded the destruction of my peace. The pain didn't disappear overnight, but for the first time, it felt like it was leading somewhere, toward a life that was truly mine. Not long after, I realized healing wasn't just about feeling better. It was about unlearning everything he taught me to believe about myself. For years, he made my boundaries seem dramatic, my emotions too much, and my intuition unreliable. So I started practicing the opposite. If something felt wrong, I paused. If someone crossed a line, I named it. It was awkward at first, like learning to walk again, but it felt real. I also found myself becoming more selective with the people I allowed into my life. When colleagues or friends shared relationship stories long or hinted at their own toxic relationship stories, I recognized patterns instantly. The subtle digs, the strategic silence, the emotional manipulation hidden behind charm. Instead of absorbing their chaos like I used to, I protected my energy. I offered empathy, not excuses. That shift felt like freedom. One night, lying in bed, I realized something surprising. I wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. In fact, I preferred my own company over any situation that demanded self-betrayal. I felt grounded in a way I never had before. And deep down,
I knew this wasn't the end of my journey, just the calm before I uncovered a truth about myself I had ignored for too long. It happened during a conversation with a close friend who had no idea what I'd been through. She casually said, "You always seem so strong." And for the first time, I didn't shrink at the word. I realized I was strong, not because I survived one of those relationship stories long that break people in half, but because I finally stopped abandoning myself to keep someone else comfortable. That truth settled into me like a quiet revelation. In the weeks that followed, I started journaling every morning, something simple but grounding. I wrote about the red flags I ignored, the moments I dimmed my light, the times I felt small but smiled anyway. Seeing everything on paper made the toxic relationship stories I lived through feel like someone else's life, a life I had outgrown. I didn't write to understand him anymore. I wrote to understand myself.
The more I reflected, the clearer everything became. I realized I'd spent years trying to earn love from someone who couldn't even be honest with himself. And instead of breaking me, that realization rebuilt me. It taught me that real peace comes from trusting my instincts, even when my heart wants to negotiate. What I didn't know then was that this newfound clarity was about to guide me straight into the biggest turning point of my entire story. The turning point came on a random Tuesday, the kind of day that feels forgettable until it isn't. I was organizing my emails at work when I stumbled on an old message he'd sent me. One of those overly sweet, performative ones he used to send right after making me feel guilty. Reading it with fresh eyes made my stomach twist. It wasn't affection, it was strategy. I finally saw the manipulation for what it was. The same pattern I'd heard in countless toxic relationship stories, but never imagined I'd lived myself. That moment pushed me to dig deeper, not into his life, I was done with that, but into my own reactions. Why had I forgiven so much? Why did I stay when my intuition whispered warnings I pretended not to hear? I spent evenings walking alone, letting my mind replay scenes without the fog of denial. Each memory aligned like puzzle pieces that had always been there, waiting for me to stop rearranging them into something prettier. And that's when it clicked. I didn't need closure from him. I didn't need explanations, apologies, or last conversations. The truth was already complete, even if it hurt. For the first time, I wasn't trying to heal for him or to prove anything to anyone. I was healing for me. And deep down, I sensed this clarity was only the beginning of a shift bigger than anything I had expected. A few days later, I had an unexpected moment of peace that felt almost unreal. I was sitting in my car after grocery shopping, just staring at the steering wheel when a wave of relief washed over me. Not happiness, relief. The kind you feel when you finally put down a heavy box you didn't realize you'd been carrying for years. It reminded me of those relationship stories long where the protagonist finally breathes after the storm, and I guess that was me now. That small moment pushed me to reconnect with parts of myself I had abandoned. I started painting again. Nothing fancy, just messy colors on cheap canvas, but it felt like reclaiming tiny pieces of my identity. While I painted, memories surfaced, not to torture me, but to show me how far I'd come. Even the most painful toxic relationship stories couldn't erase who I was before him, and who I was becoming after. And strangely, that's when I stopped feeling ashamed. For the first time, I didn't blame myself for what I tolerated. I didn't cringe at the memories or question my worth. Instead, I saw my past self as someone who just wanted to be loved. Someone who tried her best with information she didn't have back then. That compassion cracked something open inside me, a doorway to a version of myself I hadn't met yet. And she was so much stronger than I expected. A few weeks later, something inside me shifted again. Not loudly, but in this quiet, grounding way. I started noticing how differently my body reacted to peace. My shoulders weren't tense all the time, my breathing wasn't shallow, and for once, I didn't wake up feeling like I had to prepare for emotional impact.
It felt strange at first, almost suspicious, like the calm moments you hear about in those relationship stories long that feel too good to be true. One night, while cleaning out a drawer, I found a small notebook I'd bought years ago but never used. I opened it without thinking and wrote one sentence: "I'm finally safe." Seeing those words made my eyes burn. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't poetic. It was just true. I'd lived through toxic relationship stories that twisted everything into chaos, and now I was finally learning what safety felt like in my own skin. From that day on, I made a promise to myself. No more shrinking, no more doubting my instincts, no more abandoning my own voice. I didn't need to rebuild myself into someone new. I just needed to come back to who I was before fear taught me to disappear. And as I stepped into that version of me, something unexpected happened. I started feeling ready for the part of my story I had been avoiding for months.
The moment I admitted to myself that I was finally ready, something unexpected happened. I stopped running from the memories I used to shove into the darkest corners of my mind. I sat with them, the good, the bad, the humiliating, and for the first time, they didn't control me. They felt like old photographs from one of those relationship stories long that shaped who you become, not who you are. It was painful, but it was honest. As I let myself remember, I saw patterns I had never noticed. The way I apologized for things I didn't do. The way I tried to earn affection he freely gave to everyone but me. The way I clung to hope even when the truth was right in front of me. These realizations didn't break me. They clarified me. They showed me I hadn't been weak. I had been loyal in a place that fed on my loyalty. And that distinction changed everything. The deeper I went, the more I understood that my survival wasn't the ending, it was the foundation. I had lived through toxic relationship stories that would have crushed a different version of me, but somehow I was still here, more awake than ever. And now that I finally faced the truth without flinching, I felt something new rising inside me. A quiet certainty that the next step of my healing would demand even more honesty than I ever expected. It was during one of my late night reflections that I finally stumbled onto the truth I had been avoiding for months. I wasn't healing from him anymore. I was healing from the version of myself who believed that love meant endurance. It hit me like cold water. I had spent years walking on emotional eggshells and calling it loyalty. That realization was heavier than any of the relationship stories long I had replayed in my head. I began to unpack the deeper wound, the one that taught me to ignore my own needs to keep the peace. It wasn't just his manipulation, it was every moment I silenced myself to avoid conflict. Every time I convinced myself I was overreacting. Every time I felt small and still tried to be grateful. No wonder toxic relationship stories clung to me so tightly. I had been trained to equate self-sacrifice with love. As I unraveled this truth, a strange mix of grief and relief washed over me. Grief for the years I spent bending myself out of shape, and relief because I finally understood the pattern that had followed me through every relationship. And as painful as it was, this clarity felt like the beginning of something bigger, a shift that would force me to rewrite every belief I once accepted without question. I stopped pretending my small daily compromises were just giving in and started calling them what they were, sacrifices of my own peace. I began saying no without the familiar apology, refusing half-truths and arguments disguised as charm. Those tiny choices added up fast, and for the first time in years, I felt my boundaries hold like real armor. After surviving so many relationship stories long, this felt less like rebuilding and more like returning to myself.
Then I made decisions that looked simple but were radical. I declined late night calls that used to hijack my evenings. I turned off red receipts, and I stopped explaining my schedule to anyone who didn't respect it. People around me noticed. Some pulled away, some leaned in, but I no longer centered my worth on their comfort. In toxic relationship stories, the quiet exits are often the hardest, but they're also the purest acts of self-rescue. Most important, I started trusting my instincts as if they were a compass rather than a whisper. When something felt off, I acted before doubt could erode me. When someone crossed the line, I named it aloud. It wasn't drama, it was tools, boundaries, consequences, and consistency. And with those tools, the version of me who tolerated crumbs began to vanish, replaced by someone who expected a full table. Walking away wasn't a single dramatic scene. It was a series of small, unwavering choices that added up until the story changed. I left with no need to humiliate him, to prove anything, or to collect apologies. My only proof was the calm that settled in my chest. Months later, when I look back at those toxic relationship stories I lived through, they're not the whole of me. They're the reason I learned to trust myself. If you've watched this unfold with me, remember that leaving doesn't always look heroic, but choosing peace repeatedly is how real courage shows up.